Hello there, this is Yana Smakula for WPlus9 and thank you for joining me today. In this video, I'll share an easy way to create an almost one-layer, no masking card. I'm going to be using several stamp sets from WPlus9, starting with the Freehand Florals, Hand-Lettered Things stamp and also a die set, and Dockside background stamp, and I'll be using the X pattern to embellish the background of my card. For my cardstock today, I decided to go with this beautiful oatmeal paper from WPlus9. I had no idea WPlus9 makes paper and was very happy to discover this one along with a few other colors. I absolutely love the little natural flecks of fibers embedded into the paper. I think it is perfect for simple one-layer projects and adds just the right amount of wow to a card. Here's a test piece that I did where I stamped the background using very light silver lining gray ink. I wanted to show you this piece to better explain my chain of thought, and so that you can see how the design of a card changes from start to finish. It might look like one thing in my mind, but it will end up being something completely different when I put it on paper. Okay, so let's get started and do some stamping. I've trimmed my paper to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, so this is a panel I'll be putting on an A2 card base. And you can work directly on a card base if you like, but I prefer working on a panel and then sticking it on a card. I'm going to start by creating a colored sketch for my flowers and leaves. To do that, I will use the base layer of every image I'd like to stamp on my card and will stamp it using the lightest color of ink for that particular image. Think of this as drawing or sketching. When you draw, you go from a general shape to a more detailed shape. So say to draw Earth, you'll first draw a circle and would later start adding continents and oceans inside that circle, as opposed to first drawing a detailed image of, say, African continent, and then adding everything else around it to draw the Earth. And I hope this makes sense. So same here, I'm just using the base layer for each image and stamping just the base layer of all of my images, so creating a general look, as opposed to stamping one image from start to finish and then going to the next one and again stamping that one from start to finish. Now, there's nothing wrong in going from start to finish for each image if this is what you like to do, but it is a little bit faster for me to stamp all base layers and then come in and add second and third layers later. And it's also a little less confusing, and I tend to make less mistakes. I first stamped the largest images, largest flowers, using my lightest yellow, Hayride, and I stamped 3 of those to create a visual triangle on my panel. When stamping a pattern, you want to start with the largest image first. That will make it easier to fit smaller images around it. Next, I added large leaf cluster, and again I used lightest color, my lightest green, last leaf, and I stamped it in several sections next to my flowers and also coming into the pattern, so going over the edge. The next step is to add additional flower, the medium-sized one, and again I'm stamping just the base layer. I'm using Miami Spice and stamping those flowers in 3 sections onto my card, again creating another visual triangle. Going back to the leaves and using a smaller leaf cluster and adding more greenery to my floral pattern. The majority of my sketch is done. I've sketched out the most important elements. I can now use smaller pieces to fill in the gaps and add details. I'm going to speed this part up, not to keep this video too long. So you want to continue stamping base layer of your images to add to your pattern and make it fuller. If you'd like to have some empty space in your background, that's completely okay to do. I'm leaving the bottom middle part free of any flowers or leaves, as I know I want my background pattern to shine there later. And I'll also need a place for sentiment, so I'm keeping that in mind as well. Once we've added these images, the base layers, to our background, we can go ahead and start adding detail to our sketch, meaning we can start stamping second and third layers onto our flowers and leaves. I'm using Sweet Nectar to add detail to the long blooming cluster, and I'm stamping this onto all images of this type. And by doing this, I'm saving a little bit of time. I'm moving on to the next image type, and again adding a second layer. I'm going to continue doing this until I've added detail to all of my images. The colors I'm using are Hayride and Wild Mango, so only 2 yellow colors for the yellow flowers. There is a third layer for each of these, but I decided I had enough detail already and I didn't use it. I'm also using Miami Spice, Sweet Nectar, and Flamingo for the peach colored flowers, And finally, last leaf, an apple teeny for the greenery. So here's what my pattern looks like when it is all stamped. Notice the empty space there intentionally left for the background stamping and the sentiment. Before we can move on to the next step, which is adding a background pattern, we need to make sure the stamping is completely dry. I was using WPlus9 dye ink. This is a fast drying ink, and it won't smear. The stamped impression won't smear when you rub it with your finger. It is dry to the touch immediately, but it might not be dry enough for heat embossing, especially sections that have 2 or even 3 layers of ink. So I'm using my heat tool to dry this panel. Once it's dry, I'm using my anti-static powder tool and adding some powder over my stamping to eliminate any static and grease from my fingers so that my embossing will stay nice and clean. I mentioned this will be a no masking kind of card, so in other words, we will not be masking the stamped panel when working on the background pattern. For some reason, I'm not into masking lately, so I try to think of other ways to stamp something and not mask my project. And the trick here is using embossing powder. With embossing powder, you can swipe it off your project before heat embossing it, meaning before making it permanent. So I can stamp the pattern, add embossing powder, remove it from places I don't want it at, and then heat set it. The trick to doing this is using a non-watermark embossing ink. So use embossing ink that doesn't leave a watermark. I found that Tim Holtz Distress Embossing Ink Pad doesn't give you a watermark, so I use that for stamping my background. So here I have the Axe pattern stamp from the Dockside background set, and I've mounted it onto a clear block with grid lines to make it easier for myself to align the pattern on my card. I've aligned the background on my work surface and stamped the pattern. Now it's time to add embossing powder and remove excess embossing powder from sections you don't need it at, like our flowers and leaves. This takes a little bit of extra time, but it removes the need for masking. You can do masking if you prefer, but for me, this method seems a little faster. I'm working in sections here. So I'm stamping, I'm adding embossing powder, I'm stamping again, adding more embossing powder, and then heat setting. By heat embossing this Axe pattern in the background, I'm creating a trellis for my flowers and adding a nice garden theme to my card. I'm using clear embossing powder here because it is the most forgiving color in my opinion. But you can also use white or even gold or other colors. I'm going to use U die from the hand-lettered thank you set and going to cut it out of WPlus9 Dove Gray cardstock. To pop this element up, I'm also cutting it out of scrapbook adhesive foam sheets. These have adhesive on both sides and have been designed specifically for die cutting. I love using them for my projects. I've made a mistake here and cut it the wrong side up, so the backing paper came off easily from the wrong side. So I had to place the die with the die cut still inside onto my card base, press it down, adhere it down, and then remove the die cut from the die. Had I removed it before, I risked deforming it. And once I had it on my paper, I removed the other backing paper and adhered my light gray die cut over it. I also heat embossed our one of a kind so that the sentiment now reads you are one of a kind, and I foam mounted this heat embossed sentiment over the U die cut. I created an A2 top folding card base out of same oatmeal cardstock, adhered my stamped metal on top, and then finished this card. Later, I came in and added white enamel dots where the lines were supposed to cross. There was space for that, and I think that made this card look even better. You can also add pearls or little sequins if you like, or skip adding anything at all. So here's a closer look at this almost one layer no masking card. Thank you so much for joining me today. Be sure to check out WPlus9 for more creative inspiration. See you next time. Bye!